They mocked her civilian clothes, called her a consultant like she didn't belong. But what they didn't know, the drone they'd all failed to control. She built its mind. While Lieutenant Hayes clung to his polished pins and crumbling protocols, she rewrote the rules in silence. Stick around, because when Ghost Recon's Echo takes the console, outdated rank means nothing. And when the truth hits command center screens, they won't remember who gave the orders, only who made the mission possible. We read every single comment, so tell us where you're watching from and what time you found this. And don't forget to subscribe. Lieutenant James Hayes stared through the reinforced glass of Blackwood Range's command center, his reflection a monument to military precision. The morning sun glinted off his command pins as he watched the approaching figure of Ilera Vance, her civilian attire, an offensive contrast to the crisp uniforms surrounding her. The distant hum of Acheron drones filled the air, a sound that had always reinforced his authority, until now. "Lieutenant Hayes, your new consultant has arrived." His aide announced the words tasting like ash in Hayes's mouth. He adjusted his perfectly aligned pins, savoring their cold metal beneath his fingers. These symbols of command had become his armor, his identity. "Send her up." Hayes's voice carried the weight of 2 decades of unquestioned authority. The command center was his domain, each officer and technician moving in precise orchestration to his will. But this woman, this Ghost Recon operative with her unorthodox methods, threatened to disrupt everything. The elevator doors opened, and Ilera Vance stepped onto his floor. Hayes noticed several junior officers filming discreetly with their phones. They'd sensed the coming storm. His jaw clenched as she approached her confident stride, lacking the proper deference. "Ms. Vance," Hayes said, emphasizing the civilian title. "Welcome to my command." He deliberately invaded her personal space, towering over her. "I trust you understand the chain of command here." Vance met his gaze without flinching. "I understand results, Lieutenant. Your Acheron program is failing. That's why I'm here." The room fell silent. In the distance, a drone's engine whined to a stop, the silence deafening. Hayes felt his face flush as nearby officers pretended not to watch. One phone camera shifted slightly, catching his reaction. "You forget yourself." Hayes growled, fingers instinctively touching his command pins. "This is a military installation, not your playground. Colonel Madsen may have approved your presence, but I run this facility." "Actually, Lieutenant," a deep voice cut through the tension. Colonel Richard Madsen stood in the doorway, his expression grave. "Ms. Vance has full authority to evaluate and modify the Acheron program. Her experience with Ghost Recon makes her uniquely qualified." Hayes felt the ground shift beneath his feet. His kingdom built on order and control began to crack. Already he could see the video clips spreading through the base's internal networks. By tonight, Hayes Falls would trend among military channels. Type "control" if you've ever watched authority crumble, flashed across screens sharing the confrontation. In his mind, Hayes recalled his first command instructor's words, "Power isn't in the pins, Lieutenant. It's in the respect you earn." He'd forgotten that lesson somewhere along the way, replacing it with rigid control and unquestioning authority. The question hung in the air, like the desert heat. Could Lieutenant James Hayes survive this challenge to his authority? Or would the arrival of Ilera Vance mark the beginning of his downfall? Hayes straightened his uniform, a gesture now more nervous habit than confidence. Through the command center windows, the Acheron drones sat silent on the tarmac, their failures a testament to his rigid adherence to outdated protocols. His kingdom of control was about to face its greatest test, and deep down a small voice whispered that perhaps it was time for change. "Ms. Vance," Hayes said, each word carefully measured, "shall we discuss your recommendations?" But his fingers still gripped his command pins like a drowning man clutching a lifeline, unaware that his world had already begun to shift beneath his feet. Lieutenant James Hayes stared at the monitoring screens, each flashing indicator a personal affront to his authority. The Acheron drone's erratic movements perfectly mirrored the chaos threatening his carefully ordered world. His jaw clenched as he caught Illyra Echo Vance's reflection in the darkened display, her calculating gaze following the drone's every deviation from protocol. Another critical system failure. The technician announced, his voice carrying a note of defeat that made Lieutenant Hayes's stomach turn. The lieutenant's fingers traced the cold metal of his command pins, these symbols of authority that had always guaranteed compliance until now. 20 years of unwavering military discipline, of knowing exactly where every piece belonged on the board, and this ghost recon operative dared to suggest it was all wrong. The memory of his mentor, General Matthews, surfaced unbidden. Control is everything in warfare. James, the old man had said, polishing his own pins to a mirror shine. Without absolute command, you have chaos. Those words had shaped Lieutenant Hayes's entire career, but now they rang hollow against the drone's defiant performance metrics. Recent studies from the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency flashed across his tablet, damning evidence that traditional command structures were becoming obsolete in autonomous systems. Hayes dismissed them with an angry swipe. Science be damned. Structure and hierarchy had won wars for centuries. Sir. A junior officer approached, tablet extended. The previous test failures? There's a pattern? Hayes's blood ran cold as he scrolled through the data. Every attempted override, every forced compliance protocol had only degraded the system further. Worse, someone had compiled all 17 failures into a devastating analysis that was gaining traction in military technology forums. The drone failure wasn't just trending, it was becoming a case study in rigid thinking. The weight of his command pins seemed to double as he noticed Colonel Madsen's absence. His strongest ally in maintaining traditional protocols had been conspicuously scarce since the morning's disastrous demonstration. The isolation crept in like a desert chill. Lieutenant Vance's voice cut through his thoughts, measured and precise. The drone's learning matrix is showing interesting adaptations to our previous attempts at control. The way she said control made it sound like an archaic concept, as outdated as cavalry charges against tanks. Hayes's reflection in the monitor looked suddenly older, the lines around his eyes deeper. Every failed test was another crack in the foundation of everything he'd built his career upon. The automated warning system blared again, its rhythm matching his quickening pulse. Have you considered, Vance continued, her words carrying the weight of inevitability, that perhaps the system isn't failing, but evolving beyond traditional parameters? The question hit Hayes like physical blow. He gripped the edge of the console knuckles white. The drone executed another unscripted maneuver, its movements fluid and purposeful, nothing like the rigid patterns they'd tried to enforce. For a fraction of a second, Hayes saw something beautiful in its defiance, and that terrified him more than any failure. Type control if you've ever watched your certainties crumble. His inner voice, once so confident now, whispered doubts he couldn't silence. Had his entire approach been fundamentally flawed? Were they fighting against evolution itself? The next generation of officers already viewed his methods with barely concealed skepticism. How long before he became as obsolete as the systems he championed? The day's headlines scrolled past, military innovation stalled by traditional command structure. Ghost Recon Star questions drone protocol. Acheron program time for new leadership. Each one felt like another nail in the coffin of his authority. Lieutenant Hayes watched as Vance approached the drone's maintenance bay, her movements as precise as the machine she'd championed. The sight of her easy confidence made his own rigid posture feel like a costume, a relic of an era rapidly fading into history. His command pins caught the harsh fluorescent light, no longer badges of authority, but weights threatening to drag him under. "Sir," another officer approached, hesitant. "Director Chen from DARPA is requesting access to our unfiltered test data. He's citing concerns about systemic resistance to advancement." Hayes felt the walls of his carefully constructed world beginning to crack. In the drone's reflection, he saw not just a failing project, but the end of an era, his era. And in Vance's knowing gaze, he glimpsed a future he wasn't sure he was ready to accept. Lieutenant James Hayes stared at his reflection in the command center's darkened screens, his fingers still tingling from where they'd slipped off the drone controls. The morning's disaster played on endless loop in his mind, not just the drone's near-catastrophic malfunction, but the way Ilera Vance had stepped in, making him look like a fumbling cadet. His chest tightened as he recalled how naturally she'd handled the situation, her movements precise, where his had been panicked. The ambient hum of servers felt deafening in the empty room. Lieutenant James Hayes pulled up the classified files he'd been avoiding, his personal access codes, opening doors that should have stayed shut. They're buried in testing logs from 3 years ago, he found it. The original Acheron drone control architecture. His breath caught. The base code bore an unmistakable signature, one he'd dismissed when it first crossed his desk. Vance's work integrated seamlessly into systems he'd claimed as his own. Warning notifications flashed across his screen as automated systems detected his intrusion. Lieutenant James Hayes quickly closed the files, but the damage was done. His throat constricted as he realized the implications. If anyone dug deeper, they'd find his fingerprints all over the cover-up. The weight of his medals suddenly felt like lead against his chest. His secure phone buzzed. A message from Colonel Madsen. "Emergency meeting, 1500 hours. Bring full program documentation." Lieutenant James Hayes's hands grew clammy. He'd built his career on maintaining absolute control over Acheron, but now that control was slipping away like sand through his fingers. In the corridor outside, he heard technicians whispering about the morning's incident. "Did you see how Vance handled that drone, like she wrote the system herself?" Lieutenant James Hayes quickened his pace, their words chasing him down the hallway. The program was his life's work, or so he'd led everyone to believe. Now each step felt like walking on crumbling ground. The drone hangar loomed before him, its massive doors reflecting the Nevada sun. Inside, Vance stood beside the recovered drone, her hands moving over its surface with familiar intimacy. Lieutenant James Hayes watched from the shadows, his chest tight with recognition. Every gesture, every diagnostic sequence, they were exact mirrors of procedures detailed in those buried files. His reflection in the drone's polished surface showed a man he barely recognized anymore. Lieutenant James Hayes reached for his command insignia, the metal cold against his trembling fingers. 3 years of carefully constructed authority undermined in a single morning. The sound of approaching footsteps sent him ducking behind a maintenance console, his heart pounding against his ribs. The original control systems were elegant. Vance's voice carried across the hangar. Whoever tried to modify them didn't understand their true purpose. Each word struck like physical blows. Lieutenant James Hayes pressed his back against the cold metal, fighting the urge to flee. His phone buzzed again, this time with a base-wide alert. The testing logs he'd accessed had triggered automatic security protocols. Soon they'd trace the breach back to him. Lieutenant James Hayes felt the walls of his carefully constructed world beginning to crack. The drone's engines hummed to life under Vance's touch, that same haunting purr that had replaced his chaos earlier. Lieutenant James Hayes clutched his insignia tighter, remembering how confident he'd been just hours ago. Now each breath felt like borrowed time. Have you ever watched your life's work crumble before your eyes? Drop a 1 if you know this feeling. The sun was setting over Blackwood Range as Lieutenant James Hayes made his way to the emergency meeting, each step heavier than the last. In his briefcase, fabricated documentation felt like it was burning through the leather. But in his pocket, his phone continued buzzing with security alerts, counting down to the moment when truth would overtake fiction. The sound of that perfectly tuned drone engine echoed in his ears. No longer a symbol of his authority, but a reminder of everything he'd stolen. Lieutenant James Hayes paused outside the conference room, straightening his uniform one last time, knowing it might be the last time he wore it with pride. Behind those doors, his carefully maintained control was about to shatter completely. Lieutenant James Hayes stands rigid at his command console, muscles tensed, as he watches Ilera, Echo, Vance move through the test zone with infuriating confidence. His command pins feel heavier than ever on his chest, each gleaming point a reminder of the control now slipping through his fingers. "Show me the drone's targeting metrics again." He barks at the technician, refusing to acknowledge how the Acheron unit moves with unprecedented precision under Vance's guidance. Her hands dance across the control interface with practiced ease, each motion an echo of the legendary Ghost Recon signals that had made her infamous. The whispers rippling through the control room cut like knives. Echo. It's really her. Hayes grips the edge of his console until his knuckles whiten. The drone's quiet hum perfectly matches Vance's measured breathing as she guides it through maneuvers his team had declared impossible just hours ago. His carefully constructed narrative about the program's limitations crumbles with each successful objective she completes. This is a direct violation of established protocol. Hayes announces, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent control room. The Acheron program has specific operational parameters. Parameters that have failed consistently for the past 8 months. Lieutenant Vance interrupts without taking her eyes off the drone feed. Sometimes the old ways need to evolve. The drone executes another perfect maneuver, and Hayes feels the eyes of his entire team shift from his rigid stance to Vance's fluid confidence. His authority hemorrhages with each passing second. Type evolution if you believe in breaking free from outdated systems. A notification pings on Hayes' tablet. Tworker Echo Rises is trending across military forums. His grip on the console tightens as he reads comments praising Vance's innovative approach. The drone's hum seems to mock him now, a continuous reminder of his failing grasp on the situation. "Lieutenant Hayes." Colonel Madsen's voice cuts through the tension. "I believe it's time we acknowledge that Ghost Recon's methods might have something to teach us." Hayes watches his reflection in the control room window, a man desperately clinging to obsolete power as the future unfolds before him. His command pins catch the light, no longer symbols of authority, but weights dragging him into the past. The drone completes its final approach, settling into its dock with perfect precision. Vance stands, her quiet confidence filling the room more effectively than Hayes' shouted orders ever had. "Sometimes, Lieutenant," she says, meeting his gaze directly, "the greatest service we can do is admit when we're wrong." Hayes reaches up, fingers trembling slightly as they brush against his command pins. In their reflection, he sees every rigid regulation and outdated protocol he's championed. With deliberate movements, he unfastens them and places them on the desk. "Mission accomplished," he says, quietly, finally surrendering to the wave of change Vance has brought to Blackwood Range. The drone systems power down its hum, fading to silence as a new era begins. Share this video if you've ever had to let go of control to embrace progress. Tworker Echo Rises. Lieutenant James Hayes removed his command pins with trembling fingers, each metallic click echoing through the now hushed command center. The weight of arrogance, so long worn like armor, crumbled beneath the crushing revelation. Echo, the Ghost Recon legend herself, stood before him, her presence more commanding than any insignia he'd ever worn. All this time, Lieutenant James Hayes whispered, his voice carrying the weight of 1,000 misguided orders. I thought authority came from these. He placed the pins on the console, their polished surface reflecting the soft blue glow of the perfectly synchronized drone displays. The same drone system he'd fought so desperately to control now hummed in perfect harmony with its rightful master. The screens around them displayed a cascade of global responses. Dr. Echo lives trended worldwide, each mention a testament to his monumental misjudgment. Lieutenant James Hayes watched as decades of military doctrine collapsed in the face of Echo's innovative approach. His own face appeared on screens worldwide. The moment of his confrontation with her already viral, his arrogance preserved for posterity. I never saw it, Lieutenant James Hayes confessed, addressing not just Echo, but the entire command staff. We were so focused on maintaining control, we forgot what true mastery looked like. The drone's gentle hum seemed to underscore his words, its synchronized performance now a symphony rather than the cacophony he'd created trying to force traditional protocols. The security footage from earlier confrontations played on loop across social media. Lieutenant James Hayes watched himself scene after scene, dismissing Echo's expertise, clinging to outdated procedures that had nearly destroyed the Acheron program. Each clip garnered millions of views, accompanied by comments celebrating Echo's vindication and his own humbling. Traditional command structures aren't always the answer. Lieutenant James Hayes acknowledged his voice carrying new wisdom. Sometimes the greatest warriors wear no medals at all. He gestured to Echo's simple attire, devoid of military decoration, yet commanding more respect than any uniform he'd ever worn. The drone executed another perfect maneuver, its movements fluid and natural, in ways their rigid protocols had never achieved. Lieutenant James Hayes stepped back, allowing Echo full access to the command console. The transformation in the program's performance was immediate and undeniable. Share this moment. Lieutenant James Hayes addressed the recording devices he knew were capturing everything. Let it stand as a testament that true authority comes from wisdom, not rank. He turned to face Echo directly. I hope others learn from my mistake faster than I did. The command pins lay forgotten on the console, transformed from symbols of power into reminders of hubris. Lieutenant James Hayes stood straighter, paradoxically more dignified in his surrender than he'd ever been in command. Around them, Dr. Echo lives continued to surge, carrying their story to every corner of the globe. Type Echo wins if you believe in breaking free from outdated systems, flashed across screens worldwide as Lieutenant James Hayes's journey from opposition to acceptance became a viral symbol of necessary change in military thinking. The Acheron program would be revolutionized, but more importantly, Lieutenant James Hayes realized so would the way they thought about authority expertise and the courage to challenge established systems. His command pins would find a new home in the military museum, displayed alongside the story of how Ghost Recon's Echo transformed not just drone warfare, but the very nature of military leadership. As the sun set over Blackwood Range, Lieutenant James Hayes watched Echo work her expertise, flowing naturally, effortlessly. The drone's hum had become a melody of progress, innovation, and the triumph of true skill over mere rank. His final words that day would be shared millions of times. Sometimes the greatest victory is learning when to step aside.